I am Father Henry Sands. I am a priest of the Archdiocese of Detroit, and I am full-blooded Native American. I belong to the Ojibway, Ottawa and Potawatomi tribes, which are found in the Great Lakes area, mostly in Michigan. And in our language, we call ourselves Anishnaabe. All three tribes have very similar language, and this name, Anishnaabe, means the people. And all Native Americans in their own language call themselves the people, and then we have different names for people who belong to other tribes. To give you an idea of what these other names are like, what we call Americans or Caucasians are Chimokaman, and what that means is great knife. Mokaman means knife, Chimokaman means great knife or big knife, because when we first encountered the Europeans who came over, they had these guns with the big knives on them, so that's the name that we use for people who are of European descent. And I grew up on a reservation which is about an hour north of Detroit. It's an island, and in Ojibway we call it Kajwanong, which means where the waters meet, because it's actually composed of a few islands that form part of a delta at the end of the St. Clair River, which is part of the Great Lakes system. It's where the St. Clair River empties into Lake St. Clair, just about an hour north of Detroit. So I was very fortunate that I grew up in a Native community, and there are many blessings and good things about being in a Native community, and there are also a lot of challenges. So that's what I wanted to speak about today, because the topic of my presentation is our continuing mission to go where there is need, to talk about where we are today, Native Americans, in the relationship with the mainstream, and where we're at in our relationship with the church, and doing that in the context of this great missionary work that has taken place over more than 500 years. So the first part of the presentation has to do with a lot of the challenges that we face, and then some of the challenges that we face in our efforts to evangelize and provide pastoral care, and then some of the things that we could do to try to address where it is that the Lord wants us to go, because missionary work is the primary thing that we're called to as Christians, as Catholics, to proclaim the gospel of Jesus Christ. And so it's really a wonderful thing that the Europeans came more than 500 years ago, and that they brought the gospel with them. And we are called to proclaim the gospel of Jesus Christ, all of us, every day of our lives, and all of the circumstances of our lives. And we can do it very overtly, but we can also do it in ways that are not so obvious, prayer being a very important way that we do that. So I'm going to begin now to talk about some of the situations and circumstances of Native Americans here in the United States today. So there are approximately 5 million people who identify as Native American, around 3 million who are just of Native American descent, and then a little bit over 5 million people who have some Native American background, identify as Native American, but also have some other kind of background. And in the 10 years between 2000 and 2010, there was a growth of over 1 million people in our population, which is more than 25%, 26.7%. So that's very rapid growth when you look at the total population of the US, which only grew 9.7% during that time. So Native Americans tend to have more children than other Americans. We're like Hispanics in that regard. And we also are a young population. We're young because we have a lot of people being born continually, but we're also a young population because our lifespan is shorter than other Americans as well. And we live all over the US, but there are concentrations of Native Americans in different states, California having the largest population, given that California has the largest population of any state to begin with. But other states, such as Oklahoma, which at one time was Indian country, the part of the country where the government tried to move all Native Americans in the 1800s, and also Arizona, which has a population of Native people that has been pretty constant throughout the whole period of the growth of the United States, throughout the whole history of the United States. So there have always been a lot of Native Americans there, and there are to the present day. And there are 15 states that have more than 100,000 Native Americans. As I said earlier, we are about 5 million in the country, which is a little bit over 1% of the total population, and so it's not surprising that the numbers that you find in each state are not huge, but there are 15 states that have more than 100,000 Native Americans living in them. So if you look at what concentration of population there is in each state, it's not really big. The state that has the largest population of Native Americans is the state of Alaska, where almost 20% of the people are Native American and Native Alaskan. Native Alaskan are the people that we typically think of as Eskimo. And so the term that they use in English for themselves today is Native Alaskan. And then you have other states, Oklahoma, which was Indian Territory, 12%, New Mexico, a little bit over 10%, and South Dakota, a little bit over 10%. And New Mexico and South Dakota, those are populations that have been there historically and continue to be fairly large in relative terms to the present day. The median age of Native Americans is 29, and you compare that to the median age of the whole population, which is 37. As I said, because there are a lot of young people, and also our lifespan is shorter than other groups of other groups of Americans. And then the tribes themselves are numerous. At the time that Columbus and the first Europeans came, there were more than 500 tribes. They still number in the hundreds. I don't know if anybody's identified exactly how many distinct tribes still exist, but it numbers in the hundreds. And so the populations in each of those tribes is not huge, but the top ones are the Cherokee. There are about 800,000 Cherokees in the United States. The Navajo, over 300. The Choctaw, almost 200,000. And then the tribe I belong to, one of the tribes I belong to, Ojibway or Chippewa, is 170,000. And then the Sioux, which is another one that a lot of people have heard the name of before. They have around 170,000 as well. So that just gives you some idea of the diversity of the population among people who are Native American here in the United States. And then in 28% of the homes, people still speak the language. There are hundreds of languages still that are spoken among Native Americans in the US, and some of the tribes are doing better in maintaining their languages than others. I happen to belong to the 3 tribes that all speak the same language, Ojibway, which is very strong because our population is large, and in our communities there are a lot of people who speak the language. And what's happening today in a lot of communities is that the language is taught in the school as soon as the children begin to go to school, which is a good thing because there is, for example, right next door to my home, there is a community which is Delaware, or Lenape, who are originally actually from this area, and on that reservation, there's only one person who speaks the language. The tribe itself has a number of speakers still, but there are many communities today where the language is dying out because it isn't passed along to the younger people, and you only have older people who speak the language. And it's actually the case in the whole world that indigenous languages all over the world are disappearing very rapidly. So we have a lot of challenges. They pertain to education, employment, housing, things that happen due to prejudice and racism. And so if you look at the situation for Native Americans, we have a very high rate of high school dropout. More than 50% of the young people who go to high school drop out. We have the highest rate of child mortality. We are, in a lot of ways, like the populations in third world countries living here in the United States, because we live in very isolated areas. So there's a very high rate of child mortality, infants who die at a very young age. We have a very high rate of suicide. That pertains to a lack of hope, which I'm going to talk about earlier. I'm going to talk about later. There is an extreme lack of hope among Native Americans for lots of reasons, and that is one of the issues that we are best capable of addressing as Catholics, as Christians, because we have the gospel message of our Lord Jesus Christ, which is a message of hope. But because of the lack of hope, because of the brokenness that people experience, there is a high rate of suicide, especially among young people. As I just said, among teenagers, there is a high rate of suicide. That is a very large problem in Native communities. And there's also a high rate of teenage pregnancy. One of the positive things about this situation is that Native Americans do not believe in abortion. So we have situations where young ladies get pregnant, they're not married, but they have their children. And we also have, very large, close, extended families, so that helps when it comes to raising children because, a young woman who has a child has her parents and her grandparents and uncles and aunts and others who can help out. So although there is this problem of teenage pregnancy and the young ladies are not married, they do not abort their children. They have their children and raise them, and they also receive help from the members of their extended families. So in 2010, 28.4% of Native Americans lived in poverty. That's a really big problem. And a lot of that has to do with those who live on the reservation living in areas where there are not opportunities for economic development. There are not jobs that are close by. The land that we were given when the reservations were set up is land that is not arable. It's not land that you can grow things on, and there are not other kinds of economic activities that you can do very well on the land. And then a lot of Native Americans moved to urban areas. More than half of the Native American population actually lives in urban areas in cities, even cities like New Haven. And they come to the cities not really having the appropriate education or skills that enable them to find good work. So a lot of them end up living on welfare and then eventually will move back to the reservation. So both on the reservation and off of the reservation, there is a high incidence of poverty. It's the same statistic. So on the reservations, this issue of poverty is even greater than it is overall. On some reservations, the number of people living in poverty is greater than 80%. I have friends who visit the reservations that are in South Dakota, and they have provided me with statistics that say that more than 80% of the people that live on the Pine Ridge Reservation and the Rosebud Reservation, which are very large, they have thousands of people, more than 80% of the people are living in poverty, and more than 80% of the adults are unemployed. So we have the lowest average income of any group in the United States. Our median income on average, and this is on average, so it means that there are a lot of people who make less than this, is $35,000, which compares to $50,000 for the whole population. And that $50,000 figure also covers other groups of people who also are challenged when it comes to income. Yes?
Is there not government assistance to the Indians as well as
Yes.
equal to those in other states?
There is assistance that is available in different forms, and I'm not sure that the programs that have been implemented have been very effective. So yes, it is possible for people to get social assistance, for example, to live on welfare. There have been different kinds of training programs and other efforts to try to turn the situation around, and I don't think that anybody has found a really good solution so far. The whole situation is very complicated, and I'll talk a little bit about that in a while. But there are programs that have been available, and some of them I'm sure have made a positive difference, but the whole situation overall is just very dire, and so I think that a lot more study is needed, a lot more efforts to try to figure out what can be done to really help. So the unemployment rate, as I said, is very large on the reservation, and so that means that people have to rely on government assistance just to subsist, just to survive. Housing is a very difficult problem on reservations because the government holds the land in trust for us, and so what that means is that if somebody wanted to get a loan from a bank to build a house, the bank is not going to provide them with a loan, because if payments are defaulted, then the bank has no recourse. They cannot repossess the land. In a situation that most people deal with, you go to the bank, you apply for a mortgage, you get the mortgage, you make your monthly mortgage payments. If you don't, then the bank takes it back, and they can possess the house and foreclose and then sell it and recoup some of their money or all their money. But in this case, for Native Americans who live on reservations, that's not possible. The federal government provides money every year to assist with building some houses. And I can just share from my own personal history that when I was young, my parents received a small loan from the government so that they could build a house. It wasn't enough to build an entire house, but it enabled them to put up most of the elements that were needed to put up the foundation, to put up the frame. I think it provided for the roofing material, but there were a lot of aspects of the house that needed the work to be completed by us. So the fortunate thing is that there were a number of our family members who all were in this situation at the same time, so they helped each other to put insulation into the frame, to put up the drywall, to put the flooring on the floor, to put in the plumbing, to do the painting and all those kind of things. So that's what my parents did when I was very young. So they were fortunate to receive money to build a very small house. And in later years, they were able to save money to build a larger house. But most Native Americans live in really small houses. They get these houses that are not adequate for their needs, built from poor materials. There are no zoning laws, so the quality of the work is usually very bad. And then they have to live in these houses for years and years and years. If you ever saw the housing on a reservation, it's very sad. The houses are typically in very poor repair. A lot of them were built beginning in the 50s and the 60s and are still being inhabited today. A lot of them have more than one generation of family living in them. So it's a really serious problem. Having an adequate house is one of the fundamental things that most Americans and many people throughout the world take for granted, and it really does make a big difference when it comes to having sound family life, providing stability and safety. And so that's something that's really lacking for a lot of Native Americans who live on reservations. So as a result of the situation, there are more than 90,000 homeless or underhoused families in the United States. And 30% of housing, which I think is probably a statistic that is lower than the reality, are overcrowded, and less than 50% are connected to a sewer. So on a lot of the reservations, people don't have running water. They have to use an outhouse, and there's still a lot of houses that don't have electricity and don't have telephones and so on, which I'll be talking about in a little bit.
Excuse me, do they have septic, though? Do they have septic?
Yeah, so they would have a septic system if they can afford it. But there are some people who can't even afford that, so then they have an outhouse. The house I grew up in had a septic system. We did have running water in the community where I live, but that had been introduced, I think, after World War II. I remember my grandmother's house didn't have running water when I was a child, and her house did not have electricity. But when I was growing up, our house did have running water, we did have electricity. So when it comes to home ownership as well, less people own their home. 54% of Native Americans and Alaska Natives own their houses, compared to 65% of the population overall. So that doesn't sound like a big gap, but I think it also accounts for people that are not really considered to be people that would own a house. So there are probably a lot of people that aren't being counted when it comes to providing a lot of these statistics. Okay? So if you live off the reservation, it's also often very difficult to get a mortgage because you don't have the right kind of employment history or credit history. So that's also a challenge. On the reservation, you can't get a mortgage at all. And if you're off the reservation, the likelihood is you're going to get turned down for the request that you make to get a loan. And while the budget for providing housing has increased for other groups of people, for Native Americans in the in recent history, it's actually declined. So the amount of money that's being provided for housing for this group of people who are really lacking in adequate housing has actually decreased. It should really be going in the other direction. Yes?
That money that is allocated for Native Americans, Is there also allocation for Native Americans from that amount that could be used if they do move off the reservation, they want to get housing and raise their family? And like I know in
Yeah.
Rapid City, South Dakota, there are
Mhm.
many Native Americans live there. Is there any
Right.
special, like we do for other
Yeah.
persons?
The federal government doesn't provide any kind of assistance in that regard, but one of the things that has helped with this situation is that a lot of tribes now have casinos. So a lot of them are using the proceeds from the casinos to provide loans for their members to build a house on the reservation, or else to buy a house off the reservation. So that is having a positive impact, the fact that there are casinos.
On a plain poverty level, and they want to get based on the regular federal guidelines to get a help, like
Mhm.
special mortgages, they can just do it on their own, on poverty level, right from the taxes.
Yeah. Well, you have to keep in mind that the amount of money that is provided overall is limited. And so a lot of times, we're not really taken into consideration. Even though, there are funds available, they often don't make it to the Native Americans who could take advantage of it. Okay, so these are just a couple of other things. Having inadequate housing means that the house isn't properly sealed, which means that, there's a big problem with mold infestation, and also, just not having the ability to heat the house properly in the winter, or to cool it when it's hot, So the housing is just very inadequate. That's probably one of the big challenges that people face when they live on the reservation, is the kind of housing that they have to live in. So these are some of the things I was mentioning earlier. Compared to the overall population, 10 times the number of Native Americans are lacking electricity. More than 10 to actually 20 times the number of people who do not have indoor plumbing in the U.S. are not having indoor plumbing among Native Americans in the U.S. 18 times the number of people without proper sewage disposal. More than 18 times the people who do not have adequate kitchen facilities. And then 10 times the number of homes that don't have phone service. So 53% of Native American homes do not have a phone, as opposed to 5% for the population overall. So things that everybody pretty much takes for granted are not things that Native Americans necessarily can take for granted. Okay? And then health is a big problem. The government does have a health program in which they try to provide health care to Native Americans, but it's very inadequate. And you get people who are in the health care profession who are not interested in moving to remote areas. They don't want to leave the places that they're familiar with, and also the salaries are typically lower, so just providing the right kind of personnel is a challenge, and then having enough money to provide the right kind of care is also a big challenge, and people do not have health insurance either. So Indian healthcare is a very large enterprise, and they do help, but when you compare it to the needs that exist, it's actually very, very inadequate. So, 29% of Native Americans do not have health insurance at all, compared to 15%. I think this 15% number for the whole population is probably lower now since Obamacare has been introduced, but we're still, not anywhere near what, the coverage of health care is for the whole population. And there are a lot of different kinds of health issues that we experience. One of the big ones is diabetes. And that's because historically, we did not eat the kind of diet, we didn't have the kind of diet that we have today. So we didn't have the quantity of food that is available for people to eat today, but we also did not really have much in the way of carbohydrates. So because of that, because our physical bodies are kind of programmed to have a totally different kind of diet, there is a really huge incidence of diabetes among Native Americans in the U.S. I have many family members who have diabetes. I have family members who have lost limbs, who experience, the loss of their eyesight, people who die at a young age because of diabetes. So it's a really big problem. And so it's one that everybody's aware of, but and I think that there are all kinds of education programs to help people to know what to eat properly, but then if you think about it, if you're living in poverty, then the kind of food that is available that is not more costly is the exact kind of food that you should not eat. And you see that in other populations that deal with poverty as well. It's not just Native Americans, but because we also have the biological background that we do, we are not able to assimilate well, the diet that is so common today, especially for people who do not have a lot of money. So there are other problems as well, such as domestic violence and also sexual abuse. The statistic said that 1 in 3 Native American women are raped in their lifetime, and actually they're raped by men who are not Native American. They're raped by men who go to Native communities and somehow are able to get themselves into these relationships or develop relationships with different groups of people. And that's an issue that is being dealt with in the court systems right now because it has been difficult until recent times for anyone who did not belong to a reservation to be prosecuted, for example, if they committed rape or domestic violence, but those laws are changing. But that's a big problem. Domestic violence is another big issue, which I think really comes out of the lack of hope that people have. And so these are just among many of the social issues that we have to deal with. We also have a lower lifespan. We're more prone to be injured in different ways, in car accidents, accidents in the home, accidents at work. There's just a higher incidence significantly. As you can see, that more Native Americans die by injury by the age of 44 than any other cause. And also mental health is an issue. Yes?
Father, what about alcoholism and drug addiction?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's also a problem. I'm going to talk about that in a second.
Is it rampant or is it getting...
It's not rampant. It's there's a higher incidence. Okay. Yeah, and I'm going to talk about it in a sec.
Oh.
Yeah.
Ahead of my time, I'm
Right.
sorry.
That's okay. Yeah, I'm going to mention it. I think after this slide, I'm going to mention it. You've all heard this term post-traumatic stress syndrome, and I think it's a very appropriate term to be applied to the situation that Native Americans live in. From the time that North America was beginning to be settled by the Europeans, there's been a lot of conflict. There's been a lot of fighting over land and the rights to land, and there have been different efforts that have been made throughout the history of these interactions to marginalize Native Americans, to put us to the side, to eliminate us, to assimilate us, and so on. And because of that, I think it's very, very appropriate to say that Native Americans, overall experience something similar to what we call post-traumatic stress syndrome. We often talk about it in terms of people who come back from war, and I really believe that the application of this thinking is very appropriate when it comes to the experiences of Native Americans who have this history of injustice, who have this history of their ancestors being killed, who have this history of being displaced and moved around the country, and who live in poverty, who live without hope of just having, a normal life. So because of that, then it has an impact on your mental well-being. And so that's also something that has to be dealt with as people try to live their lives each day. This statistic says that 77% of Native Americans and Alaska Natives have at least a high school diploma, as opposed to 86% of the whole population, and that only 13% of Native Americans have a bachelor's degree, as opposed to 28% in the whole population. So you can see that education is lagging among us. And we don't have a lot of Native people who become educators, which is really unfortunate because most of the young Native people do go to school on the reservation, and it would be really great to have teachers who are also Native, but it's not a profession that a lot of Native people pursue if they do get a post-secondary education, because there are other fields that are more lucrative. We all know that teachers are not paid well. So this is something that would be good to see change. We don't go to Catholic schools. We don't go to any other kind of private schools because the cost is prohibitive, and also because we don't live near schools that are private. Even if there were scholarships available, we don't live near them, and we don't have the money to do it. And we don't know, typically people don't have in their family somebody who's done that. So, something helps in whatever endeavor you're undertaking is to have role models, to have people in your family who've done it before you, because it helps, to show you the way, and that's very lacking. And then this last one is just saying that only 19% of post-secondary students who are Alaska Native or Native American have completed a bachelor's degree. When I worked at the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops, we commissioned a study to look at Catholic population in the U.S. We wanted to see, what percentage of people were Catholic among different groupings of people, such as European descent Americans, Native Americans, African American, those who were from the Asia Pacific region of the world. And so we undertook this study. It began in 2013. It was completed in 2014. So I just wanted to share a little bit of the information from the study with you. And what we found is that the group of people who have the highest incidence of being Catholic in the U.S. are Hispanics who are born in Latin America. And it's 66.6% of people who are from Latin America who live here in the U.S. are still Catholic. The second largest group were Filipino, 64.8%. The third largest group were Hispanics who were born here in the U.S., Hispanic or Latino, that was 58.9%. And then it continues on. So if you look at people who are of European descent, then 21.6% of people who are of European descent in the United States are Catholic. And for Native Americans, that number is 20.7%. So as I mentioned to you earlier, there are more than 5 million Native Americans in the US, and if 20% or 1/5 are Catholic, then that means that there are about 1 million Catholics in the United States. And the incidence of being Catholic among Native Americans is about the same as in the whole population. And what I want to say to you about religion is that the vast majority of Native Americans identify with a Christian denomination. And the denomination that they identify with or participate in is a function of what group of missionaries went to the communities where the people lived. So if we look at Michigan, for example, half of the communities that are native in Michigan were evangelized by Catholic missionaries. So the incidence of Catholicism in the state of Michigan is about 50%. So you have communities that are Catholic, and then you have others that are mostly Methodist, because the Methodists were very active in missionary activity in Michigan in the late 1800s. But then if you go to the Southwest, to provide one other example, just about 100% of the Native people who live in New Mexico, Arizona, and California are Catholic because of the missionary activities of the Spanish missionaries who went there, many, many years ago, beginning more than 400 years ago. And then you get areas of the country where there are not very many Catholics at all. So about 1 million Native Americans are Catholic, 20% of the population, according to the research that was done. And it's probably higher, but this was a scientific study that was done, and so when we completed it, different groups came forward, such as Hispanics, and said, well, there are actually a lot more Hispanics who are Catholic, but we didn't want to use any subjective or anecdotal information. We wanted to conduct this in a scientific manner and live with the results. I think that they give a good indication of the number of people who are Catholic in the country who come from different backgrounds. And then we also just broke down the population of Catholics by diocese. And this has been very helpful in working with the bishops who have Native American populations in their diocese, especially the ones who think that they don't have any at all, because it's often the case that you get a diocese, such as this diocese, for example, where you would have Native Americans living here. This diocese is Bridgeport? Hartford. Okay, so let's just look at Hartford. Right here. So in the Diocese of Hartford, this is Catholic population. There are 634,000 people who are non-Hispanic white European descent in the Diocese of Hartford. Is it diocese or archdiocese? Archdiocese, okay. There are 54,000 Hispanics who are Catholic in the Archdiocese of Hartford. There are just about 6,000 people who are of Asia Pacific descent who are Catholic in the Archdiocese of Hartford. And there are almost 7,000 people who are African American who are Catholic in the Archdiocese of Hartford. And then there are about 800 people who are Native American in the Archdiocese of Hartford. So in an archdiocese like this, people would probably not be very aware of Native Americans living here because it's such a small population and we tend to just be dispersed in various communities within the boundaries of your archdiocese, and also would be very small in number, in a particular parish. But this study was very helpful for the ministries that I've been involved with Native American ministry, Hispanic ministry, ministry to people of Asia Pacific descent. And then this map just shows where you have incidences of parishes that are predominantly Native American. So you can see that it's mostly in the Southwest, in New Mexico, Arizona, and not even so much in California. But then you have a bit more concentration in North Dakota and South Dakota. And then around the rest of the country, there are not very many parishes that are predominantly Native American, just because our populations are so small. So, I wanted to present you with this very pretty picture, first of all, but I want you to know that that we do live in very difficult circumstances, and it's been that way from the very beginning up to the present day. I know that there are a lot of organizations that are involved in activities to help people who are in need in the United States and outside of the United States. And one of the things that I hope to do in my role as the director of the Black and Indian Mission Office is to help people to be more aware of the needs that people have in our own country, particularly people who are Native American and African American. So that is one of the reasons why I wanted to share with you about these circumstances of life for Native Americans here in the United States today. And continuing on in that vein, before I talk about some of the things that I think we can do that can really help to make a difference, or just to talk about the kind of challenges that we face as we make the efforts to evangelize and to provide pastoral care for Native Americans. So the first thing is that we have this really difficult history, okay? And I think that most people know something about some of the things that have happened in the past. From the very beginning, there have been efforts made to colonize us, to incorporate us into the life of the European Americans who came, to take over the land, to create the country, and that has had very negative implications for us. There have been efforts made to annihilate us. There were a lot of wars that were fought as expansion took place in our country, so there were battles in which people were killed. And there were also, once the country was settled, efforts made to just to put us aside. The government in the early 1800s decided that they wanted to create Indian country in the very center of the continental U.S., and they thought that we'll just send, we'll take all of these people who live all over the United States, who are the native people, and we'll move them to the middle of the country. And that was very devastating for the people who were subject to that, complete lack of respect for their God-given freedom and dignity. And you can imagine what it would be like to be taken from the place that you live in and that you always known, and to be forced to travel on foot for the most part, hundreds of miles to a new place that you did not know at all. And many people died on those journeys. There are different journeys that are called the Trail of Tears. They apply to the Cherokees. That's the most common one that people think about, but there are other tribes that were forced to do the same. I belong to the Potawatomi tribe, which I mentioned to you earlier, and there's a Trail of Tears that has been documented for the Potawatomi people who were moved from Michigan and moved to Indian country. There is an archbishop in the United States who is Potawatomi, and that is Archbishop Charles Chaput, who is the Archbishop of Philadelphia. And his mother was Native American. She belonged to the citizen band of Potawatomi Indians who are in Kansas. And the reason that they are in Kansas is because they were moved there by the government in the 1800s. The Potawatomi people are originally from Michigan, and that's where Archbishop Chaput's ancestors would have been from, but they were moved to Kansas, to Indian Territory in the 1800s. And then in the 20th century, there were a lot of efforts that were made to try to assimilate us. The government had a program after World War II that they called the relocation program, in which they provided money for Native Americans to move to urban centers, thinking that, well, if they can move from the reservation where there's a lot of poverty and have assistance to move to the city, then they'll mingle with the mainstream, become part of the mainstream, have the kind of jobs everybody else does and live the same kind of life as everybody else. So in the late 50s through the early 70s, there were actually significant populations of Native Americans in different urban areas. I remember in Detroit, which is close to my home, that there were a lot of people living there. And in New York City and other big cities such as Chicago, Los Angeles, and so on, you'd find similar populations of people, but that experiment really didn't work, and people eventually moved back to the reservation, because they didn't have the kind of education or experience that would enable them to be able to live well in an urban environment, and it was something that was not familiar to them at all, so it didn't work. And then an ongoing dynamic for us is just, the whole matter of racism, which people don't like to talk about or think about. And in our country, people tend to think about racism being something between black and white people, which it is. But it's also something that has very negatively impacted Native Americans. In my own life, I could tell you that when I was a child, when we would go to a town just next to our reservation, people did not treat us very well. I remember when I was a child going to the movies, and when we went to the movie theater, we had to sit in the balcony because that's where they had the Indians sitting in the balcony. And I recall a restaurant, they had a section in the back of the restaurant that was for Indians. They had a partition that divided, the restaurant from the back where we sat. And those are things that I've experienced in my own life in Michigan, in the north, and people tend to think that these things, are something that are in the long distant past. These are not the kind of things that, Native Americans would have experienced, but, those are the kind of things that I experienced. My mother's parents were taken away as children, very young children, and sent to boarding schools. This was in the beginning of the 20th century, and they were not allowed to return to their own life until they were adults, until they had finished high school. So again, something that was done that really violated the basic dignity and freedom that, Native Americans are provided for by God Himself. And it's had a very devastating effect on Native Americans to the present day. The reverberation of the negative impact on my grandparents' life continues to the current generations. So there's a lot of dysfunction that has come about because of that. And I asked when I was a child, why did nobody do anything about it? Why didn't their parents do anything? And it's because in the United States, Native Americans were not considered to be legal persons until 1924. Before 1924, we had no legal rights. We couldn't go to court. We couldn't engage a lawyer to assist us. We were considered to be something less than human. And it was that way in Canada until 1960. So these are just a couple of examples of racism at work in our country. And today, things are much more underground. Racism is still alive and well, but there are laws to prevent overt kinds of behaviors or actions that were so common in the past. But we still face a lot of discrimination and a lot of being excluded from just the mainstream life of the United States. So I mentioned this boarding school debacle. The Catholic Church actually administered a lot of the schools. The government came up with the idea, but having a religious community operate the schools was a great idea because it cost a lot less than other solutions that they could have come up with. So for a lot of Native Americans, they see the Catholic Church as an enemy because, it was the Catholic Church that ran these schools where our ancestors were taken to and where there was a lot of abuse. There was physical abuse, there was emotional abuse, they weren't fed properly, and there was a lot of sexual abuse. So there's a lot of anger, a lot of hurt around this whole issue. Yes?
Are you going to talk about Doris Day, how she contributed?
I'm not aware of it. What do you know about it?
Wasn't she the one that gave her fortune?
Oh, yeah, St. Catherine Drexel. Yeah, I'll talk about her. Yeah, she is actually the one who started the organizations that I am serving in right now. Yeah, she did a lot of great work. Yeah, she really did. Yeah. A lot of Native Americans see Christianity as a white man's religion. All right, so that's another thing that needs to be addressed. But we have the answer. Christianity is for everybody. The Lord came to make Himself known to everybody and to save everybody. So that's something that is not all that difficult to address, really, if you can speak the truth. There's also been a return to practicing traditional Native American religions and also a development of neo-Native American religion where people take elements of things that they've learned from religious practices of tribes in the past and put something new together. And in my opinion, what that is all about is, the poor job that we've done in bringing the gospel to Native Americans, and so it just speaks to the need to bring it anew, which is what I'm going to talk about in a minute. And then the issues I've already talked to you about, the poverty and, the lack of hope that exists, because of all the other problems. If people ask me, what are the biggest challenges that Native Americans face today, I tell them that the biggest challenges that we face are a lack of hope and also the inability, the unwillingness to forgive the injustices that have been committed in the past and that continue to the present day. Okay? And in a moment, I'm just going to say, how we address that as Catholics, as Christians. And then we're subject to the same kind of materialistic and secularistic influences that everybody else is subject to, with the profusion of media and availability of media, and also people who are able to live a more affluent way of life. They forget about God and they forget about their brothers and sisters in need. I was thinking about this today. When I grew up, we were not, we were fairly poor, but we didn't live that much differently than people who were not considered to be poor. I had friends, when I went to school off the reservation who lived in houses that were not that much bigger than my house. And, the people who were well off, such as, a doctor, the kind of house they lived in wasn't huge or it wasn't even so luxurious as, the houses that we see today. I actually had friends who had parents who were both doctors, and they bought a house that was old and run down and they fixed it up. The dad drove this really old car to work and the mother took the bus to work, So the difference between the way of life for people who were more well off and the people who were not was not that great. And most people did not have, a lot of extra to go around. And one of the things that I recall when I was young is that, people were much more generous and ready to help others that were in need. There was an awareness of people who were in need. People had a greater connection to the requests that were made in parishes to offer money for collections for blacks and Indians, to offer collections for the poor children in Africa and China and so on, because people in general were not that far removed from, those kind of circumstances. But today, it's so much easier to not even be aware of the needs of others because it's so easy to live in a cocoon where everything is so comfortable and so, so luxurious. And so, the same kind of thing can happen, even among Native Americans. And so, that's another challenge when it comes to continuing the mission of proclaiming the gospel. Okay, so what do we do? The first one, we need to just proclaim the gospel. I know people that think that, there are some ways that we need to change it in order to reach groups of people like Native Americans or Hispanics or others, but we just need to proclaim the gospel. That's what the first missionaries did when they came here. They came here because they knew that the mission of the church is to proclaim the gospel of Jesus Christ. They knew that there were people living here in this continent who had not heard that gospel, and they saw that it was their obligation, their duty, their responsibility to do it. So they came. They came and they knew that it would cost something. They knew that it would require sacrifice. They came knowing that it would not be easy, but they came and they did, and they were very faithful. And so I'm very grateful because, my Catholic roots are thanks to these missionaries who came. My ancestors in my mother's family met the Jesuits in northern Michigan in the beginning of the 1700s. So my ancestors' initial contact with Christianity is a long time ago. And the missionary activity continued through the early 1920s because there were still groups of Native Americans who had not had much contact with European settlers until that time. But we need to continue the mission today. There are ways that we who are Catholic have forgotten that our call is to be missionary. There are ways that we've forgotten that we are called to evangelize, that we are called to proclaim the gospel. And so, more than anything else, that's what we need to do. And as I mentioned to you earlier, Native Americans are very much lacking in hope and also unwilling to forgive the injustices that have been committed. And we have the message that they need to hear, the message that our hope is found in Jesus Christ. It doesn't matter what our circumstances are, it doesn't matter what our history is, that the Lord is always able to give us the hope that we need, the hope that we can embrace to help us to deal with our present circumstances, to deal with the things that have happened in the past, and to look forward in a positive way, to look forward with hope and to make changes in our lives so that they're better. And also the need to forgive. There are many incredible injustices that have been committed against Native Americans in the past and today and likely going forward. And in my own family history, there are a lot of really unfortunate, sad, difficult things that have happened. But because my parents raised me with faith, because my parents raised me to know that I had the same dignity and worth as anyone else, because my parents raised me to know that whatever I wanted to do, I could make the effort to achieve and accomplish, I've been able to do that. And my parents passed along these messages to me because of their faith in Jesus Christ, because they embraced that gospel message and because they lived it. And so that is what is needed for so many Native Americans, to hear that same gospel message and to know that it's true and to see it lived out among people and to say, I want to be like you. I want to have what you have. I want to turn away from this miserable situation that I live in and know that there's something better that awaits me right now in this life, but also in the life to come, because that is the ultimate source of our hope. Yes?
Father, I want to ask you about faith formation.
Mm-hmm.
You were living on reservation when you became a priest. Do you still have Catholic formation?
Yes.
Education?
Yes, we do.
How did you get your calling? Did someone sponsor you?
No, my calling just came from the Lord himself, and I responded to the Lord's invitation to call me to the priesthood. But I would not have been able to respond to that call if I had not been formed in the faith from a young age, and if I had not made decisions on my own as an adult to follow Jesus Christ. And so we need to provide the opportunity for other Native Americans, and especially Native American young people, to do that.
And this is just for information.
Yes.
I'm not trying to be provocative. I welcome the chance for the Native American to make some money in America with casinos. But do you know if they're contributing any to your support, to the causes you espouse?
Yes, they are. They are addressing a lot of these issues with the money that they get. They do. Yeah. Okay?
To know.
Yes.
No.
Right. Okay. And then if there was some way that there could be a public acknowledgement of these past injustices in some way of offering an apology, and I have a question mark behind all these things, because that's not something that I could say, bishops, you need to do that, or Holy Father, you need to do that. But what we can do, what I can do, and what all of us can do is to pray that could come about, because that also can make a very positive difference. So the bishop, the religious congregation, the Holy Father, the Bishops' Conference, and other entities, if they publicly made some kind of offer of apology or acknowledgement of past injustices committed, that would be I believe that would be a very helpful thing. And I know that Native Americans have asked for that in different ways. And then, in dealing with all of these financial, economic, and social problems, we have all these great organizations that can help out, such as the Knights of Columbus, United States Conference of Catholic Bishops, the Catholic Extension Society, and so on. My office, the Black and Indian Mission Office, there are ways that we can collaborate to help provide solutions for the housing crisis, to help to provide opportunities for education, to provide opportunities for employment training, and so on. So one of the things that I hope that I'm able to do is to help to bring together these different organizations to be more intentionally involved in these kinds of endeavors. Our office actually does provide a lot of grants to missions and schools and parishes and ministerial programs and dioceses to minister to Native Americans and to African Americans. And one of the things that I would say about education is that the people who I know who are Native American and African American who have good, solid marriages, who have good, solid family life, and who are leaders in their communities are people who have received Catholic educations. It makes a really huge difference in the lives of people who live in really difficult circumstances to have the stability that's provided, to be given, the possibility of dreaming of a future that can be different than, what they know and what they experience, as young people where they live. And so I really hope that we can do a lot more to make available educational opportunities for young people, Catholic educational opportunities, because it can make a huge difference, not only in terms of stability in family life or in marriage or to be better off economically, but also so that they can actually become bona fide Catholics, disciples of Jesus Christ, and to be able to receive the gift of salvation that the Lord wants everybody to receive. I just talked about education, and also to pray for and promote vocations. There are very few Native American priests in the United States. I would say there are less than 10. And I know 3 priests, but they're all elderly, and so they're not really too active. So there's a great need for more priests, more need for religious brothers and sisters. And so one thing that we do to ask the Lord for vocations is to pray, but also I'm hoping that I can work with entities that are involved in promoting vocations. The USCCB has a clergy and religious life vocation office, and there are other organizations such as the Knights of Columbus that also can assist. So these are just some of the things that I think that we can do to address, the circumstance of Native Americans today. And they're all related to the basic job that we have, which is to proclaim the gospel of Jesus Christ, to be missionary, to continue the missionary work that began when the Europeans first arrived. And I'm glad that the Lord has called me to be a priest. I'm glad that I'm able to be involved in this endeavor. And I'm glad that there are many people like all of you who have an interest in learning more about Native Americans and wanting to pray for us that things can be better and want to support the efforts to do this great work the Lord's given us, which is proclaiming His gospel. So that's it. Yes?
I see and I'm hearing a great lack of representation for the Indians. We don't hear about them. Just in the Black community, leaders in their group have risen to acknowledgement in the country and to get representation and to get help through the government and programs. Where is this for the Indians?
Well, and there are people that make those kind of efforts. Then the big challenge is that we're really small in number. So Hispanics are more than 10% of the population in the United States, I don't know, somewhere between 10 and 15%. African Americans are also similar in number. So when you have 2 other groups, that are very active in advocating and lobbying and so on, we kind of get lost in the shuffle because we're small in number. But there are efforts that are being made. Yeah, and there are different organizations that are active in the public and private sectors to try to promote, these issues that are important. Yes, yes.
Actually, I have a few people in my family who are, like their grandmother or their grandfather was a Native American,
Mm-hmm.
and they're totally integrated into society. I have watched, PBS has an awful lot of independent films about Native Americans, and actually one of the things was about Red Cloud, which
Mm-hmm.
was, many of us grew up with mom writing checks to Red Cloud, and we still get
Right.
St. Joseph's.
Mm-hmm.
But there was one particular one about Montana, and the only job was really, if you were lucky enough, it was like McDonald's, because Montana is so sparsely populated.
Right.
And it was exactly the kind of conditions you're talking about with these houses that, and an aging population or whatever, and the kids not really feeling they had any hope.
Mm-hmm.
Now, my question for you is, for the kids going off the schools who go to university or something like that, is the church doing anything for the people who are trying to move to an urban area to create like a part of a parish, or what, like say in some of the cities there'll be a Spanish church or an Indian church for people who came from India or Africa. Are you doing anything for those people? And what is the attitude from the people who stay at home about the and try to meld into the greater society?
Right. Well, one thing that the Bureau of Catholic Union and Mission has done is to establish scholarship funds at different Catholic universities and colleges. So we actually have 2 different funds at the Catholic University of America, for example. And we have another one at Notre Dame. We've got one at the Wyoming Catholic College, which is a new college that was just established a few years ago. Yeah. So we do try to support Native American young people who are Catholic and pursuing higher education. I get requests in my office from people who are going to public schools. We don't have any capability to help them out of the funds that we have available, but I do help them to try to identify assistance through the networking that I'm able to do, the entities that I know that do provide assistance. And so right now in the summer is a time when I get various phone calls and letters requesting for assistance in that way. But again, the small numbers is something that is a challenge, because if you wanted to set up some kind of organization for Native American Catholic students at a college or university, the likelihood is that there are not very many, and so it's hard to have an organization if you don't have a whole lot of people. But something that does help young Native American students is that just about every college and university will have a Native American student organization. And so my thinking is that I can get to know the people that are involved in those organizations, and then to let them know that I'm around, available, and if they have Catholic students, that those students can seek me out. And then this, I've only been in this position for less than a year, so there are a lot of different things that I'm hoping that I'll be able to do that are going to take some time that I have not been able to get to yet. But the efforts to assist students in post-secondary education is a challenge just because of the small numbers. For example, the thing that you were saying, well, maybe you could do something like this, and it'd be a great thing to do.